This past August, my book club Nevermore Notes read Carmilla by Sheridan J. Fanu. And authentically, if you were just looking for a fun, short Gothic ride, this is one you should pick up. Beyond its classic status, beyond the fact it's sapphic vampires, it is the first classic work I have read in a really long time where I just enjoyed it for the sake of it and wasn't sitting there thinking like, yeah, this is worth it for the history. And I am really hoping the book club finds more like this in the future, and this September we're going to be reading Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Glasgow, which I'm going into sight unseen blind and just hoping that it's a really fun time. Y'all are more than welcome to join us in the Nevermore Notes book club. I have a link to it down below. At the end of every month, we do a Google Meet and discuss the book live, and we'd love to see you there. But enough about upcoming anticipated releases, let's dive right into Carmilla. Using this channel's standards for what makes something Gothic, there are 9 elements total, and you only need to possess 3 of them to qualify. Spoilers for a over 100-year-old book, although I will try to only talk about those elements when they're relevant to the review. Starting with elements of horror. We're watching this young lady, Carmilla, who's sort of depicted half like she's a child, half like she is a young woman, preying on an isolated village and slowly stalking and killing our main character, Laura. And as she kills them all, she's charming, lovely, and mesmerizing. It seems like she's instilling some kind of mental link or mind control between herself and the victims, which make them more compliant, or there's just like an element of pretty privilege inherent in what's going on here that is deeply chilling. But either way, no one really seems to suspect Carmilla, even though she's the one major change in the village before people start dropping dead left and right. And outside of the whole monster stalking you kind of thing, Fanu kicks it up a notch with some truly gruesome and terrifying imagery. It's not quite extreme horror as we know in the modern era, but these descriptions do begin to show like the impact of penny dreadfuls at the time and like the public's desire for something that's a little bit more graphic in their horror story. For example, Carmilla does some shape-shifting where she goes from being like a cat to a girl in her nightgown at the bed, and when this happens her gown is like doused in blood and it super freaks Laura out. Or when we finally get to hunting Carmilla down and we dig up her coffin, she's just like laying in a blood soup of sorts. And overall, I would say a lot of the descriptions and tension here really resemble Dracula, which is interesting because Carmilla predates Dracula. So as far as like the vampire progenitor, I feel like we should be reading Carmilla and not Dracula, since you'll see most of the lore, the themes, and the issues tackled here. So if you're into vampires and you haven't read this one, you are missing out. And additionally, the level of gore and ghostly creepiness that we get here is way above and beyond something that you saw in like Turn of the Screw, for example. And it puts some of my complaints there to even starker contrast, because there is an element within Carmilla where someone sees her walking through the woods and they assume that she's some kind of ghostly apparition. The way she appears and disappears is silent, all that kind of stuff. All of which is way more supernatural than the description of the ghost in Turn of the Screw, and shows that like there was this hunger for supernatural something in this time period, and they did know how to do supernatural scares and thrills in a way that we could relate to in modern times. It just happens to all be put into something like Carmilla and not be found in something like Turn of the Screw. As far as will this book actually scare you, I don't know. Within the book club, we discussed that this is as much a love story as it is a Gothic horror. It's not a romance per se because it doesn't have a happily ever after, but there's a lot of romance in the book. And I think depending on what elements you focus on, how you interpret what's going on is really gonna decide for you whether or not you're finding these events horrific, romantic, tragic, maybe all of the above. Which is an easy segue into Character is King. The majority of this novella is a love story between our main character Laura and Carmilla. And I would say it's a resounding success. Like FYI, this is not just a sapphic-coded work. This book is really and truly gay. Carmilla and Laura kiss and make out in this book. They walk through the woods together hand in hand. Laura tucks Carmilla into bed every single night. And Laura is talking endlessly about how beautiful and mesmerizing she finds Carmilla. She calls out specific features like Carmilla's hair that she plays with for hours. She talks about how in retrospect some of her interactions with Carmilla are actually scary and a little bit creepy, but Carmilla was just so beautiful. She couldn't see any of the underlying implications. She was just starstruck by this girl. And then on top of that, Carmilla is saying a ton of super romantic things about how they have a love that transcends death, how they're fated to be together because they met each other first in some kind of dream world scenario. Like, honestly, in a lot of ways, it feels like hashtag relationship goals. Of course, Carmilla is a vampire and she is feeding off of Laura, so there is a duality in their relationship inherently. It is unclear to me if she intends to slowly feed off of Laura and then kill her and move on to the next victim, or if she is like building something that's a little bit more here, perhaps intending to turn Laura at the end. There's not a ton of contextual clues for this, except that Carmilla is killing so many people so quickly and taking her time with Laura. Carmilla is saying all these things about an immortal love that transcends death and time, or at least a passion that will, even if it leads to hatred. And I would figure that implies perhaps that she wants to keep Laura around as a companion forever. I really don't know if that was Fanu's original intention, because at the end of the work he does write up an explanation about why Carmilla kills some people so quickly and kills other people so slowly. And it's more like a malevolent, nefarious, wanting your compliance, wanting you to participate in your own death kind of thing, instead of like, I'm gonna turn you into a vampire kind of thing, at least from the perspective as it's explained to us. But Carmilla's actual intentions and choices, decisions, whole like mental capacity is very obscure to us. We can only judge it from her actions and gestures and story. And as like a modern audience, it's sort of like familiar with Twilight, where like a happily ever after for Bella is getting turned into a vampire and living immortally with Edward. We have this like burning question of, but why not vampires? Why not an immortal companion? That could just as easily be it, and why wouldn't that be a good thing? Still, like, even as a modern reader that could put that spin on it, in some ways I think it improves the work because it creates an uncertainty in me as the reader of what's going on, where we're going with this, and that tension of like, is she a victim? Is she the next planned lover? Like, kind of leaves us with more ambiguity about what's going on and creates a push and pull of like, am I watching a slow murder or am I watching a seduction? Maybe yes to both. And Carmilla is also kind of toxic. Her moods swing from one extreme to another. She's very effusive and lovey-dovey and kisses everywhere, like just brimming over with affection. But at the same time, she can turn onto a dime into someone who's like harsh and mean and assertive. And Laura does talk about how like some of these mysterious moods or angry, passionate moods made her hate and resent Carmilla even in the moment, but she didn't feel able to like do anything about it. As readers, we have the benefit of knowing that Carmilla is a vampire like way before Laura figures it out. So we can connect some of this like flighty cruelty to her sort of distracting from things that are hurting her. For example, Carmilla seems to be hurt by religious iconography and maybe even by symbols of death, period, because there's like a funeral procession for a young girl that's died, presumably one that Carmilla killed, and it's got like the cross and everything, and they're singing a prayer, and Laura wants to be respectful, like go to the side of the road, watch them pass, sing along a little bit. But like the sight of the cross, hearing the sacred words sung, like drives Carmilla into a frenzy where she becomes incredibly mean and awful about the whole situation, and it sort of like makes a scene that's highly embarrassing. But I would say by making that scene, Carmilla like successfully distracts from the fact that she is in pain and discomfort as a result of this cross stuff. So like she becomes odd and it becomes a remarkable circumstance, but not for the reasons that would actually help them defeat Carmilla. But I really like these flip-flops in moods, the explanation for why it's happening, or maybe even potentially that Carmilla just is pretending when she's with Laura and being compliant, and this like more contrary, like outstanding, opinionated person is the real Carmilla. After all, even though she looks like a young lady, she's been around for hundreds of years at this point. One would think that she'd become a little jaded to some of like the human social conventions and mores, which while this isn't something that we explore in Carmilla proper, if you guys are interested in a story that's more about Carmilla's abrasive nature, how she is contrary to society and kind of pushing against those social norms with good reason and legitimate like feminine rage, you should probably pick up Kat Dunn's most recent release, Hungerstone, because there Carmilla is in all of her glory, taking what's kind of like a side point you could infer here in Fanu's work and really expounding upon it. But if we take this love story and put it to the side, if we take take Carmilla's personal fascination with Laura and just set it to the side again. Even just looking at who Laura is as a character, where she is in her life, how she's living, she is the perfect character to go on this journey with. She's really like vibrant and smart and witty and friendly and like has this magnetic personality even through page, which I love. I think the fact that Fanu was able to write like this fully realized feminine character, was able to give us a little peek into women's lives. Like it seems as if he actually understood some of the day-to-day, some of a woman's capacity to learn and interpret, as well as like what her limitations would be. For example, when we finally do think something's wrong with Laura, her father calls in a doctor and the doctor examines her but doesn't tell her what's wrong with her, sends her out so her and her dad can talk about it. Which, like, I can only imagine being highly frustrated by that. Like, a doctor thinks something is wrong and won't tell you straight. You have to find out from your dad if he decides that it won't overburden you to know how and why you are sick. But because of that, and because we're only getting like this little singular moment in Laura's life, it does leave you at the end of the story wondering like what happens to her. Yes, she's freed from Carmilla, but are there any lingering side effects? Does she end up marrying a man when she moves to Italy? Does she remain single? Does she pick up a female companion? Does she do work of some sort, like become a governess? Or I don't know what happens to Laura. She has so much going on that's so interesting. I wish we had a little bit more of that. Rolling me into more poetic prose. Just like Turn of the Screw, Carmilla is an epistolary style novella. In the front of the prologue, we get this guy saying that these are like a letter correspondence between a doctor and Laura about this specific event she experienced. He, like us, actually wishes for a little bit more, but unfortunately in the interim, Laura's passed, so he is just going to share this one element with us. But we get a very close first-person narrative because we get Laura talking about her own life, her own memories and observations. She is very forthright with whoever she was corresponding to, giving like immediate feelings, impressions, and also providing like some retrospective context when it might matter. On its face, the epistolary style alone would win at the Gothic point, but I also found this work to be just incredibly pretty and well written. It's compact, it's to the point, it's got excellent pacing and tension, it's got great description and comparison. It feels very dainty and feminine, and I do appreciate that perhaps a bit more because it's a male author creating this for us, and it feels very authentic to me, like believable this is a woman character. I will say that I personally struggled a little bit to get into this work. It took me a while to feel the flow and like feel like I was understanding what I was reading and not just listening and reading at the same time and not processing. It could have been a me issue, but I do want to mention it because this is a very short work and it's worth pushing through that initial resistance if you're feeling it too, because once you get into the thrall of the story, it flows really well. It's like a really beautiful and engaging narrative, rolling us into elements of loneliness and longing. Laura's in extreme isolation leading up to her meeting Carmilla. There are no peers around her. Like, she does have a great relationship with her father, her governess, and her nanny, but it's really different to like have a relationship with someone who's known you since you were a child into your youthful adult ages than it is to know like a peer. What you confide in, how you talk to them, how you view them is all just really different, and I feel like Laura is really missing that companionship. She was about to have a visit from the general's ward who is about her age, and it was going to be the first time they meet, but unfortunately at the top of this we find out the general's ward has died suddenly, and as a result the general can't visit them as he intended because he's doing funeral stuff and something else that he'll talk to them about in like 3 months' time. So at this point in time, Laura's really bummed out and she thinks she's just going to have to continue to live in isolation. They're not even near a village, and if they were, there's no one there for her to talk to either. And they're kind of like walking in the woods as a family, sort of trying to cheer her up and like figure out what they're going to do for the next little while, when a bunch of carriages come around the corner and there's an accident and Carmilla spills out, apparently injured. Her mother comes over and is like, "Oh, we're on a rush journey of life and death. I cannot stop and wait for my child to recover. I'll take her to an inn." And that's when Laura's father steps in and says not only is there not an inn that's appropriate to do that, but that Carmilla can stay with them partially to please his daughter Laura, who's just lost a potential companion thanks to this like sudden illness. I also think because Laura has so few peer-to-peer relationships and such little experience interacting with peers, it makes her more susceptible to Carmilla. Like, she's less likely to realize that something is a little bit odd or off. She's more desperate to have that connection, less likely to recognize any chance that it's not great. To a certain extent, we could actually talk about Carmilla's loneliness too. After all, even if she's in this carriage group of multiple vampires, she's the only one at this youthful age. And it must feel very lonely and isolating to be alone for hundreds of years, which might explain why she is playing with Laura this way, or if it's authentic, why she's developing a relationship with Laura. All of this rolls us into elements of human mortality. This is a vampire story. If we're not talking about human mortality versus the immortality of vampires, then what are we doing? Just on its face, once you know that there's a mortal girl and an immortal vampire, you have to contrast the two states. And I would say that actually Carmilla's immortality finds her wanting in a lot of ways. Like, she's perpetually isolated. The only way she can get to know someone is through this long game feeding situation, which means at the end of the game, she's gonna be alone again through her own doing for who knows how long. Also, I think it's sort of implied that immortal beings lose their divinity or connection to the divine, which feels kind of vague in our modern day context because we're a little bit more secular, but one has to imagine it means that they have immortality within the body and have lost their immortality of soul, so they will not go on if they are killed in their vampiric form. I also am choosing to read it like it means she's lost some kind of like connective, intuitive knowledge that like religion or connection to God brings. How you weight or value that's going to vary via experience, but it does feel a little bit like picking up a short-term gain for a long-term loss in the whole mortal versus immortal area. Not to mention the whole trade-off that like to be an immortal vampire you must kill and eat humans, which were beings that were your peers at one point in time. Essentially you're like embracing the life of like a serial killer so that you can keep living. And I would think if any aspect of a person's original humanity is left within a vampiric body, taking human life perpetually would certainly strain that piece. Overall, I do think the message of vampiric existence is that humans aren't meant to live forever, and the trade-offs to manage it are not worth the cost to like the human soul and the long-term placement of your spiritual energy. I think also the point is like chasing immortality like this does lead to a shuttered, half-lived life. Whether Carmilla reaches the highs that other vampire stories do in showing you these conclusions is kind of another story. It does take us a very long time to realize Carmilla's a vampire, or to like blame these deaths and disappearances on her. So that gives the story a lot less time to emphasize her as like an evil creature. I think it's really relying on us being familiar with vampiric knowledge to kind of like fill in those gaps, which isn't necessarily bad. The story that's being told here is a lot more interesting and energetic because we don't have these long ponderous moments in it. And I do think there's enough implication there you could give the point to Carmilla. Rolling us into the supernatural element. Again, this is a vampire story. Vampires aren't real, so obviously that's supernatural. If you're questioning whether or not this is just like a general popularized myth or pseudoscience that's in Victorian times, I feel like they give us several concrete moments that sort of hammer in this is supernatural and this is real. Specifically at the climax when they're vampire hunting and they're digging up this coffin and they open up the coffin of like a several hundred-year-old girl and she's perfectly preserved and in a soup of blood. There's nothing natural about that. There's no logical way to explain yourself around that one. There are also a few more like mundane supernatural occurrences. For example, one of the servants mentions he thinks like the forest behind Carmilla's room is haunted because he's seeing like a ghostly white figure walking there, and which is Carmilla and not a ghost, so he's wrong about what's going on, but it is still technically supernatural because Carmilla locks herself into her room at night. And there is one scary dream that wakes Laura up where she insists they get to Carmilla and prove that she's okay. So they end up breaking down Carmilla's door, which was locked, entering her room. She's not there. And all of the windows and doors to get in and out of the room are locked, so they have no idea how she got out or where she could be. And based off of a couple of other things we've seen Carmilla do in dreams and stuff, I think Carmilla, like Dracula, has the ability to turn into mist, and she's like seeping in and out of the room and going out to hunt at night and coming back late in the afternoon to like hang out with the family like a normal human. Laura's dad does sort of kind of come up with a like logical reason why she'd have been able to get out of the room, but the room would still be locked. People really like logical puzzles in those day and age, and you can sort of see it in how excited the dad is to try and solve this mystery. But realistically, once we unveil that Carmilla is an immortal being, we know that she did this by supernatural and not mundane means, which adds another layer to this scene once it's confirmed for us. There are a couple other dreamlike elements that imply Carmilla can transform, come to at least Laura in dreams. Obviously, there are more mundane explanations for most of that, but it also could be just adding to vampiric lore and abilities. And then lastly, something that's interesting that's not super well explored here, but I found really like mentally engaging for me personally, is that Laura's father has just recently had a whole bunch of portraits restored, and one of them looks exactly like Carmilla. And we come to find out that's because this is Carmilla, and that means that Carmilla and Laura are related, which makes me wonder if like their dream connection, their mental connection they seem to have is authentic and related to like their family lineage more than anything else. Which rolls us into questioning the character's mental health or their reality. And I don't think Carmilla actually manages that. I think the closest we come is Laura experiencing these intense dreams where she sees a person who looks exactly like Carmilla in the dream, and then something scary happens and she wakes up crying and sort of rouses the whole house. Everybody goes looking for this person, not because Laura had a dream. There was an impression of a person next to her in the bed that was still warm when the nursemaid came to check on her. And it wasn't the nursemaid or the governess, so they don't know who this strange being could have been. But they don't find anything, so eventually the nursemaid and the governess try to convince Laura that the nursemaid was in there the whole time, and that the dream itself is like sort of her imagination and everything is fine. Even though I don't think they actually believe that themselves. But nobody like actually accuses Laura of being crazy, and even though they're trying to like shift Laura's reality to this other situation, she knows that's not true. She just like knows they're trying to calm her down. I think it would have been difficult to have a moment where people were questioning Laura's mental health and reality within the story, because she is recounting this experience long after it happened through letter. What she felt and what she experienced has already sort of been confirmed because she's already seen the blood coffin scenario. Makes use of local folklore, superstition, and myth. There is that really cool tie-in where Carmilla is in the family portraits that have been restored, and I love that. Like, this is possibly a generational thing. Perhaps this explains why Laura and Carmilla are mentally connected. Also explains why Carmilla is traveling through this area, because occasionally she has to like return to her blood soup coffin to like regenerate. And it does this fun thing of establishing in the beginning that there was once a village like a lot closer to their original home, and that everybody there died out or moved like way farther away. And we come to find out the reason that happened is because Carmilla was out there terrorizing people and eating everyone. So I really loved how this casual historic mention that's like setting up how isolated Laura is comes back into play and becomes like relevant with an explanation. And of course the climactic standoff that happens in the ruins of Laura's mom's old castle, the fact that like they've tried to kill this vampire before and failed because the guy who tried to do it had feelings for her, like all of that's really fun extra bits, and I think gives a little bit more flavor to the story and like sort of personalizes it a little bit more while making use of these normal hallmarks. And then the last thing I'll say about this is the doctor who sees Laura recognizes she's suffering from some kind of vampiric attack, which means the dude believes in vampires, in that this story and her illness is following a set group of rules about vampires and folklore just generally. Because otherwise, why would this guy know that? Why would he believe it? Like, this in and of itself is a story that can only happen in this place where this local folklore is known and truly believed. Coming around to strong sense of place. which I'm gonna unfortunately say no to this one too. I did get a strong sense of like large house isolated in the woods, and I could picture that very clearly. I also got like a decent sense of what the castle ruins look like, how long they've been left abandoned, you know, what the implications of that were. And it was atmospheric in the way that it isolated our characters and had like these great romantic descriptions of nature, the woods, Laura's home, and like how all that combines to a sense of like generalized decay. Not rich enough to live well in Britain, but here, someplace where it was cheaper to live, they're living relatively well. All of which is my way of saying that there was definitely an attempt by Fanu to create like a character of the place, but I don't think it actually pulls it off in the Gothic sense where like the place becomes a living, breathing, sentient thing. I didn't feel like the woods, Laura's home castle, the ruins of Laura's mother's ancestors, any of that like had intention or will. There wasn't that bump in the night sense that it was breathing or watching or like either in league with the malevolence or in league with them trying to help them ward off the malevolence. And this wasn't a story that could only happen in this location. There are a million other isolated places we could have told this particular story in. So while I enjoyed the atmospheric element, it wasn't something that could only happen here, and it wasn't something where the place was really like a living, breathing place, or like where I could tell you the layout of everything and exactly where we were at any given time. And that's why I'm just not going to give it this particular point this round. But wrapping it all up, Carmilla has 7 of the 9 Gothic points. And I really think it's a very unique blend of Gothic horror and Gothic romance, even though it doesn't quite qualify to be a romance. The pleasurable terror that these characters feel when they're together, the push and pull, magnetism and repulsion, is very reminiscent of how Gothic romances will tell their tales going forward. And I really love Carmilla. I think overall it's compact, it's compelling, it's got excellent pacing and just beautiful writing. And I think it has an especially interesting element in that it's a very sapphic story written in Victorian times, and generally speaking that's not something that we think is likely. And in and of itself, having that sapphic vampiric element in Victorian times makes it kind of stand out. Even though I loved Dracula, I would definitely recommend Carmilla ahead of it, and I don't know why more people haven't read it. And it might make it into one of my top reads of the year, even though I've read a lot of great stuff in 2025. But if you're looking for other Gothic works I loved, I've got a whole playlist outlining it you can look at over here, as well as a ton of standalone Gothic reviews you could check out over here. And talk to me in those comments down below. What vampire book would you recommend as my next read? And drop a vampire emoji in those comments down below. As always, keep reading.